on the behalf of COPER and as a president, Center of Pakistan and International Relations. And I request Ms. Claire, I think she wanted to join among the panelists. So please, Fahad, please add Ms. Claire as well. Yes. Hi, Claire. And Zishan, please formally start the event, please.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Good evening, everyone. I warmly welcome you all, and especially our guest speakers who have joined us today for our today's webinar. Before starting the session, I would like to start the session with the recitation of Holy Quran. Please, Fahad, play the video, please.
Fahad, there is no voice.
To Allah, Lord of the world. The entirely merciful, the especially merciful. Sovereign of the day of recompense. It is you we worship and you we ask for help. Guide us to the straight path. صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. The path of those upon whom you have bestowed favor, not of those who have evoked your anger or of those who are astray.
Thank you. Firstly, I would like to introduce Center of Pakistan and International Relations. COPER is a strategic think tank building positive narrative at the national and international level and advocating the policies to build a sustainable, inclusive, and resilient Pakistan. COPER aims to foster an effective foreign policy of Pakistan and to forge strong diplomatic, political, and economic ties of the country, along with the provision of a platform for the engagement of foreign and local speakers with intelligentsia to discuss various goals, issues, and achieve sustainable development goals. Before moving towards the speakers, I would like to give a brief overview of our today's topic, which is Hindu radicalism and Indian hegemonic designs, which can be a threat to regional and the global peace. As we see that India has witnessed a tectonic shift in the politics in 2014 when the BJP formed the government in India. Why it is a tectonic shift? Because 30 years back, we see that Congress was a completely dominant political party in India, and BJP had only 2 seats in Lok Sabha. And at that time, nobody could think that the BJP, the Hindu nationalist political party, would emerge as a mainstream political party in India. And people were least interested to talk about Hindu nationalism or Hindutva ideology, or even the future of the political party, the BJP. RSS has played a key role in the rise of BJP today. RSS was founded.
Can you show the presentation as well along with it? We can't see the presentation.
Yes, ma'am.
Can you move the presentation side by side?
Fahad, please allow me to share my screen.
It's already there. Zishan?
No, we are talking about the presentation.
No. This is not. This is presentation. I want to share my screen from.
Okay, just sure. You are host. You can do this now. Please share.
No. That was from the laptop account. Can you allow me?
Yeah, you are allowed.
Okay, thank you. Can everybody can see the slides now?
Just they're just downloading.
Yeah.
Okay, now I would like to give a brief presentation on today's topic, that is Hindu radicalism and Indian hegemonic designs, which can be a threat to regional and global peace. So I have already discussed that the tectonic shift India has witnessed in 2014 with the rise of BJP, which is purely a Hindu nationalist party, and the RSS, the Rashtriya Swaya Sevak Sangh, played a key role in promoting the Hindu nationalism and in the rise of the BJP as a mainstream political party in India. And even now, all of these things which were not relevant 30 years back, the Hindutva ideology or the Hindu nationalism, but all of these things have become relevant or even dominant today because BJP is now the ruling party in India, and the Hindutva ideology has become the dominant ideology in the mainstream Indian politics. RSS has been involved in attacks on the minorities, especially the Indian Muslims and the Christians. And according to their ideology, the Hindutva ideology, they think that these Christians and the Muslims are the invaders, and they should be either be converted into Hinduism or should be thrown out of India. And in this way, they can build India as a pure Hindu nation state. But these have been going on. These events have been the part of the RSS members. They were involved in these incidents. But why it is more concerning today? It has never been before. Why? Because now these Hindu radicals are occupying the highest offices of India. The Narendra Modi, Mr. Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, was a RSS member. The Amit Shah is now the Home Minister in India. He was also a RSS member. And with this rise of BJP in the highest offices of India, the Hindu radicals have increased attacks on the minorities. There is a significant rise of mob attacks on the Muslims since 2014. And even the government of India is itself introducing the controversial bills which are marginalizing the minority in India, especially the Indian Muslims. For example, the Citizenship Amendment Act is one example in this regard. Moreover, we see that BJP is following the more aggressive policies vis-a-vis disputed territory of Kashmir. They have introduced new plans to change the demography of Kashmir, which will be the final assault on the existence of the Kashmiri people. India has also been following the hegemonic designs in the region. But with the rise of BJP, BJP has been more vocal and aggressive towards in the pursuit of their hegemonic objectives in the region. So we see that the combination of this Indian hegemonic design and the rise of Hindu nationalists on the political realm, we see that this combination is not threatening only the peace in the region, only the minorities living in India, but also the peace in the region as well as the global peace. So in this context, we have also a short documentary to share with you. Please, Fahad, share the documentary. Thank you, Fahad. Now, I would like to invite the president of COPAIR, Ms. Amna Malik, for her delivering remarks. Her brief introduction is she is the president of Center of Pakistan and International Relations. She is a staunch supporter of human rights for the Kashmiri citizens. She is also the promoter of equal rights for all, especially the interfaith harmony, in women empowerment, gender equality, and the global peace. She has been awarded by the President of Pakistan, Dr. Arif Alvi, and the former Prime Minister of Malaysia, Mahathir Mohamad, for her extraordinary efforts and contributions. Please, ma'am, please, I invite you for delivering the welcome remarks for the today's webinar.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Hello everyone, and I'm really thankful to my honorable speakers who are here, and especially my advisor Raja Faisal, who is always an active participant and always support us in South Asian affairs and in SAARC. So I believe today's topic is something very important, which is a threat to the global peace. It's not only a threat to the regional peace, but that is a threat to the global peace. And today we are going to discuss the hegemonic designs of Indian government, and we are also going to overview the complete history. And I request the distinguished speakers that give us some suggestions, because Center of Pakistan and International Relations is doing policy advocacy, and we are working on the diplomatic relations of Pakistan with other countries as well. And we are really concerned as policy makers and as heading a think tank that why the world, especially the media, intelligentsia, civil society, why they are not seeing these human rights violation in Kashmir, in India, in Indian occupied Kashmir. And this is not only one case. Even many other minorities in India are threatened by the hegemonic designs, the dictatorship of Modi's government. So I request all of you that we need to raise our voice not only at the national level, but at the global level. So it's a global campaign to highlight these Indian hegemonic designs and request the world that we should raise our voice for human rights violation in Indian occupied Kashmir. I welcome all of you, and I'm grateful to all of you who are today, and we are waiting for some valuable suggestions from your side. And I again thank Raja Faisal Saab for joining us. And thank you, Zishan and Fahad, for coordinating this event.
Thank you, ma'am. Now I would like to invite Miss Claire Bidwell. She is a human rights activist. She is a co-founder of Led Kashmir Decide Scotland. She has been advocating for the human rights of the people of Kashmir. Please, ma'am, floor is yours, ma'am. Miss Claire Bidwell.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me along. It's a pleasure to be here and with all the guests that are here. Yeah, I'm going to share a little bit of my experience, have a little bit of look at an overview as to how I see, I'm in Scotland, so as to how I see internationally the acts of India and then to come forward with some suggestions that I hope, you know, can help us work together and take forward. So, I mean, from what I can see over here under Modi's BJP government and along with the RSS, you know, that the leadership are driving, they're encouraging and they're supporting their dominance over minority groups and, you know, exhibiting extreme Islamophobia. They're dictating to others, not just in their own country, but also worldwide, you know, and globally. So Kashmir is, you know, is an example of this. So what I've seen is just this, the alarming rise, the extent of the extremists, you know, the Hindutva, you know, and where they see themselves as superior. It's a really frightening comparison with Nazism. And you're kind of like, have we not learned anything the first time round? Having sat and watched the parallels, it's quite frightening watching it unfold in front of you with the world not listening. You know, they are in extreme violations of UNSC resolutions, human rights, you know, in violation of the Geneva Convention, and yet the international community is very quiet, and they're committing, or Modi's committing so many war crimes. If we look at the dominance and the authority of India, you know, from the 5th of August onwards, without going backwards in Kashmir, they've gone in, you know, a completely undemocratic, gone in overnight, and on a basic human level, they've gone in overnight, they've locked down the country, they've revoked their semi-autonomous state, which they've been allowed their right for self-determination for 73 years. They've sent in 900,000 troops, locked up thousands of young men. We've got women there that are half widows, pellet gun crimes, and they've removed their, you know, their politicians, and there are so many political prisoners, removing the voice of Kashmiris. So for 9 months at least, people didn't know how their family were. They couldn't contact their parents, their sisters, their brothers, and the alarm from people on the outside, wherever they were, you know, that's fear, that's mental torture, that is abuse. And that in itself, watching that control dictatorship, that is alarming, and I'm surprised that more wasn't said on an international scale. So, you know, they've showcased it as it being because there's terrorists in there, without realizing that they are, you know, oppressing and occupying a nation, and so they're going to see people fighting for their freedom in different guises. But the Western society seems to highlight that issue. That's what they promote worldwide, that there's terrorist activity in there. And, you know, again, for me, it's based then on the economic value to the world, as it were, the world powers that India hold. And I think this is somehow why they're able to go ahead with it. The BJP have such a huge influence in British politics, and I suspect American politics and politics all around the world. I mean, that recent report that came out, independent report from Europe, that showed, you know, the extent of the links where Indian diaspora have got fake Facebook accounts. They've ensconced themselves in constituencies in the UK and lobby themselves against the MPs to put their pressure on. They won't take any criticism. They are not open. Anything that is said against India, they take it as a complete, you know, violation. And then they're undemocratic. Many of them, I'm speaking, sorry, I know there's many Indian people that are standing up against the Modi government, so I'm just speaking about the Modi supporters and Modi, the language that they use, and even, you know, on social media platforms, in anywhere, they're just extreme, and they're rude, and they're ignorant, and they use a bullying tactic, and we're seeing it at the basic human level as well at the global level. I mean, they obviously have a fear. I'm thinking, you know, so many political prisoners are locked up. I'm thinking, you see, Malik comes to mind, a voice there for the Kashmiris. You know, he was accepted onto the political stage. He was able to use his voice for the Kashmiris. He'd been to UK, he'd been to America, and now he's been locked up just, you know, not long before the lockdown, based on allegations from 30 years ago, and still not seeing justice. So they've silenced him, and that there's no voice through for, you know, the Kashmiris. So I've seen, you know, there is evidence that they're committing the most atrocious crimes to humanities, and these have been documented and verified. If we look at the mass rape case of Kun and Pushpura, you know, they're still waiting 30 years for justice. At some point, I believe in the justice, you know, it was accepted that this had happened and viewed compensation. but it's all just been stalled. We've got, you know, further evidence of mass rapes, blinding with pellet guns. We've got ceasefire breaches, destructions of home and people. Again, referring to so many widows, half widows, as mass graves. And we've seen the distraught images coming out of Kashmir, you know, the young 3-year-old boy sitting on his grandfather's chest, the mother cradling her baby, her dead son at the ceasefire line with his shoes lying next to him. These are real images, and India are, you know, causing this mass destruction, which at the minute they're getting away with on the international scale because the world leaders and United Nations don't seem to be doing much about it. I believe that the United Nations sent 3 letters to India over the course of the last year, and not one was replied to. We've got then, so the education, the impact that's being had on the children, they've hardly been in school since the lockdown, and obviously with COVID, that lockdown within a lockdown, and this is going to impact on generations ahead. And if this isn't solved soon, you know, this is becoming a mass human crisis. It really is. We're looking again at any, you know, anybody speaking up, the reporters, actors, anybody that is voicing their concerns or is coming under concern. Facebook accounts, Twitter accounts are all being closed, cited under the, you know, the violations for speaking out. Yet again, that is clear, you know, Islamophobia. I think there is currently 35 American politicians that are looking into Facebook activities because, again, they're silencing them. So I think it's over 400 people that are in Indian prisons, you know, booked under the Unlawful Persons Act, the antiquated law, just for speaking up. And so it's making it very difficult for the voices to come out. So it means that the common people of the world are deprived of the knowledge, because it seems that the Indian lobbying power and the power of India do infiltrate into our media. So it's not shown, for example, in the United Kingdom, it's not in our news. An odd article might appear in a newspaper, but it's just not there. And for me, I think that is the concern, that if they start sharing these images with people, then, you know, in India's human rights violations, people are going to start standing up against it, and they value perhaps the economy too much. So, you know, we're seeing in Kashmir as well a similar model to what happened in Palestine, to just going in, changing the demography in there, which is against the Geneva Convention. And really, there's huge war crimes that are being committed by Modi that should be being challenged somewhere. He should be being taken to the international court. We've seen over the last couple of days in Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, if she doesn't get her right, her vote for self-referendum, is threatening to take the issue to court. Now, that's her looking at the self-determination being a basic human right, yet we're not facing the tortures and the crimes and the abuse and the infringement of civil liberties and freedom of voice that Kashmir are experiencing. But on that basic level, they recognize a right for self-determination. So it's a little bit like, why is it one rule for one and one rule for another? Again, you know, I work as a primary school teacher, and I feel I would not walk past another school's playground where children were beating one another up, bullying one another. You know, I would be in there, or I'd be complaining, I'd be sorting it out. So it's, why are we walking past? Why are so many people walking past another country suffering and what another government are doing to their people? I find that quite shocking, really, that with the world that we live in. So, I mean, India themselves, they are facing uprising amongst their own people. So there's glimmers of hope within there, but it's also an example of what they are doing. So the farmers protesting, you know, marching on their way to Delhi, getting hit with tear gas, any obstacles they could to put in their way. What does that show how India view their own citizens? You know, it's shocking, really. We've seen reports from the South Asia, the minorities reports, showing that it is a dangerous place to live. And again, just further evidence that this is happening. And I think, you know, India are exposing themselves. They are slowly beginning to expose themselves through the activities that they're engaging in. Again, the CAA and the rise of the women of Sheen and Bar standing up. So we've seen poverty and illiteracy rates growing, not just in Kashmir, but across India as well. Health conditions worsening. It's like they're waging a war on their own citizens, and Muslims and Kashmiris are bearing the brunt of this. I think India are also currently taking advantage of the fact that the world is concerned with COVID-19. So it's like, you know, this huge humanitarian crisis, and the speed it's going at is alarming. Very few medical facilities, you know, they're opening liquor stores, even as a small example, to distract the youth and get them away from the main thing. So health suffering on a massive scale, poverty-wise, and I think the worst thing is we've yet to see the worst of it. It's a growing crisis because of the employment issues, because of the mental health issues. And India, of course, are not engaging in dialogue with anybody. That is a huge barrier. They're saying it's an internal matter, it's their people, it's for them to deal with. They're not allowing any human rights envoys, rapporteurs in to investigate the extent of the situation. We've seen border hostilities with China, and they continue to blame Pakistan for everything. Only just yesterday we saw, didn't we, the Indian army target UN vehicles that are in there as military peacekeepers. You know, this has to be highlighted. You know, this is extreme violations, and if United Nations cannot open their eyes for this, then, you know, we're in a really worrying situation. So hopefully they've kind of shot themselves in the foot, as it were, India, with that one, you know, and get people opening their eyes. I know that Mahmood Qureshi, the foreign minister, has raised concerns. You know, he's concerned about an attack looming from India, suggesting that there is support for Modi from other countries as well. So this is, you know, of concern, because that's there all the time. They say they will retaliate larger. So this is a real threat to world security, world peace, and not less the fact that they do have nuclear weapons. So looking towards solutions towards that issue is obviously, from where I come from, I'm trying to raise awareness amongst the common person as much as I can, because I think the more people that can know, the more that can care, the more can come and do something. So the international community, and I believe the common person, have a big part to play in this. So conferences like this, you know, are brilliant because we can raise that profile, get the knowledge out there, and people can listen and come to learn and can see what we're doing, what we're all trying to, you know, attempt to do. I think the Kashmiris need to be, you know, it's like enabled to solve their own issue. They can get support from the international community, but somehow, wherever we can, if we can try and promote their voice, give them some sort of status at the United Nations where they can present what they want and their voice can be listened to. You know, and again, we can enable to raise their voices through promoting networks, working together, sharing work and linking. We need to pressure governments worldwide, whoever we are, wherever we are. I mean, recently we created a rally across Scotland where our aim was to take letters to the media. So we rose awareness going through Glasgow to the common people. We had our cars decorated with Free Kashmir. We had supporters from Palestine. We had supporters from different organisations. And we went to BBC Scotland. We went to the SSTV studios to deliver letters saying we want this on our TV. And that's something that we do need to try and break through to as well, because I do think the TV stations, again, are influenced by, you know, BJP supporters or the Indian diaspora and are stopping these things coming out. So that just examples of raising awareness amongst the common people. Obviously, the British government played a huge role in this. And I firmly believe it's their moral duty to go back and clear up their mess. I mean, thankfully, there are many British politicians that hold this viewpoint and are working hard within that, and they're building in strength and growing in support. So that's room for optimism. I know we've all got eyes on Biden as well, Joe Biden, in the hope that he will stand up for humanity. He will make that bigger. We're seeing Jeremy Corbyn just establishing a peace and justice group for humanity. So there is reason, there is hope, and that we need to just keep building on that. For me, the resolution for Kashmir is self-determination. if people work together above ideologies and for humanity to give Kashmiris their right for self-determination, I think we would see, peace within the region. So the solution there for me is pressure on United Nations and world leaders that they can enable one another, work together to send in a peacekeeping army, stabilize the area, give them their vote. That would be massive achievement, I think, to peace in Asia if that was allowed. So I think as well, the ceasefire line work needs to be done for the ceasefire line to become a ceasefire line. I mean, obviously the West are selling their weapons to, it suits them for India and Pakistan to be using them at the border, at their cost. So I think there needs to be a push for the ceasefire line, to be that, and for the UN to be enabled. I think human rights organizations globally, we should encourage to work for self-determination or highlight Modi's crimes, and work together to achieve that. I think, again, the optimism is that there are many researchers, many academics, many leaders, people here themselves working for, freedom of Kashmir, highlighting the acts of the Indian government and bringing those to the fore. So that is encouraging. And I think if we keep building the unities, keep building the strength, building our pressure to put on United Nations and world leaders, that we can find our way through this. So lots of unity, working for humanity, and raising awareness, using the lobbying power at the European Parliament, on United Nations, and seeking support from the United States and England, and hope, make it clear that we want human rights over financial, that, we want a world that's not based on economy. It's time for everybody to unite from all walks, whether they're peace groups, whether they're the environmental issue groups. I think everybody needs to try and work together and pull together and expose what's happening in our world just now before it's too late. So thank you. I think that's my contribution for this afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Claire. Very informative discussion, and you highlighted regarding there are certain number of parliamentarians who are having a different kind of opinion in favor of them, and there are certain number of parliamentarians who are having opinion regarding human right violation, and we need to raise our voices. Today this event is also live. I just want to highlight that inshallah we are going to cover 2,000 people who are going to see this event live, not only in Pakistan but other parts of the world. And I think these networking and webinars are very important. My question to you is, don't you think people are more conscious regarding their nationalities and their ethnic values, and giving priorities on their economic interests? And that is one of the reason India is trying to get better benefit from diplomatic point of view, and they are trying to engage many countries and many parliamentarians through economic engagement and other kind of engagement. And what is your idea about it?
Yes, sadly, I think you're true. I think you're right, and that it's about economic values. It's about their own country. So if I think of my own country, for example, just leaving Europe, they're looking for trade deals. So they're looking above what's happening. They're concerned about their people in their country and making sure that their people, whereas really I think we're, and COVID should have taught us this, that we should be working internationally. Our world is a lot smaller than people realize. This opportunity, what we're doing here now, shows us the value and the power of social media. We've not had this weapon before, and there's no reason why we can't support other countries and other people, and we should work away. We should definitely come away from being nationalists, and I think that Modi he's taken the perfect opportunity of this, and that sadly is how our world is working just now. But I think we just have to keep persevering forwards and change the dynamics of that. There's no reason why everybody, nobody should be left behind. We're all humans on this planet, with our one life, and we should be helping other people to have the benefits that we can all enjoy.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Claire Bidwell, for your valuable remarks on Hindu radicalism and Indian hegemonic designs, and for also being the voice of the voiceless people of Kashmir. Now I
My
would like
pleasure.
to invite Mr. Raja Faisal, who is a senior journalist and also appears on the Indian media to defend the Pakistani narrative. He is also advisor on the Pak-Indo relations and SAARC at COPER. Floor is yours, sir. Mr. Raja Faisal.
Thank you very much, Zishan. And first of all, thanks, President Koper, that you have provided us with this opportunity that we have actually gathered online and to talk with each other, to present ourselves in front of each other. I was earlier talking to Danielle. She has, I guess, joined us, and we are very thankful to Claire as well. She has joined us from all the way from Scotland, and we could see that beautiful Christmas tree behind her as well. And we wish her the coming Christmas, Merry Christmas, and to her family as well. And we have been, privileged to have her with us. And it was her views. They were very valued views. And another thing I want to announce that Karen Fisher, she had joined us today as an observer, but in the next webinar, we would be having her as a guest speaker on top of our list. And it's always good to see her views online on social mediums as well. She's a brilliant voice when it comes to speaking on behalf of Kashmir and speaking on behalf of minorities in India. Now, I would come towards the topic, today's topic. It's a very hot topic of the region. It's more like a topic which I guess in the previous century, people of Europe, they were facing the same situation which we are being faced by today. First of all, I want to give a background of the topic. Well, for the background, I would only highlight a name, which is Savitri Devi. She was a neo-Nazi who happened to be calling herself Savitri Devi, but her real name was Maximiani Portas. She was English and Greek. She was born in France. That's where it all started. She was a Hitler hailer. She used to hail Hitler. And during the previous century, when Nazism was at its peak, she was part of it. And she did masters in chemistry, and I believe in philosophy as well. That's where she started learning about different races, and she started highlighting Aryan race as a supreme race of the world. And somehow she created a linkage between Aryan race and the races which were inhabited in India at that time, Indian subcontinent, especially Brahmin race, which is considered as the supreme race of the Hinduism. And that's how it all started. And she, as we already know, that in them times, before the Second World War, and of course before 1947, British were ruling over subcontinent, Indian subcontinent. And at that time, of course, it was necessary for Nazism to have their agents in India. And that's why before the Second World War started, this name Savitri Devi, it was echoed in India at that time. I want to mention here something. Everyone who is watching this, they need to read a book which was written by Nicholas Goodrick Clark, Hitler's Priestess Savitri Devi, the Hindu, Aryan, and Neo-Nazism. It was basically, she is being discussed in this book, And this book talks about how she entered in India for spying purposes, because she was supposed to spy against the British, because British were ruling at that time in Indian subcontinent. So it was only because that she wanted to spy on them, she was in Indian subcontinent. But of course, she had to create a cover up for her, and the best cover she grabbed there, it was that she pretended to be an Aryan, and at the same time a cousin to Brahmins in India, and she injected them with radicalism. She injected them with hate against the other minorities of India at that time, especially Muslims. She said to them that if you want to get your rule back in India, then you have to have, then you have to get rid of Muslims from here. So she had that inbuilt hate within herself, and she propagated it not until 1947, or not until Second World War ended, but she propagated it until she was alive in this world, and I'm talking about 1982. So after the Second World War, she went to Europe, and she went to England, and she ended up in Western Germany as well, and she propagated there about the Nazism. She hailed Hitler even after Second World War. So that's what it was all about. And then when she was captured and imprisoned in by the coalition forces, then after that, Indians, of course, her husband at that time, who was a Brahmin, and he was one of the leaders of RSS at that time. He was very well connected within the diplomatic circles, within the government. So that influence was used to get her back to India. And in India, she continuously propagated in the heart of New Delhi against the Muslims. And we very well know that that Gandhi was murdered by one of the RSS members. I'm talking about Nathuram Godse, and it's an open secret. Everyone knows about it. And the reason why I highlighted it is, I would give two reasons. Number one, that we need to understand that whatever Germans did at that time by sending Savitri Devi, they wanted to gain their strategic goals. They wanted to wipe out British from subcontinent, so that they can have a very fair and square sort of situation where they can, in the Second World War, they can beat Britain. But the second reason is more interesting, and that is that we need to understand one more thing, that in the previous century, if we had Nazism, and if we had the Nazis, and the problem was for the European countries, today we have problem in Southeast Asia. Because in today's India, India is hegemonic towards its neighbors, its smaller neighbors, its weaker neighbors, same like Germany used to be once towards its neighbors, smaller or bigger, doesn't matter, because they had a design. They had this design that they equipped themselves before the Second World War started. They equipped themselves with arms, they created their armies, and they aggressively went towards everywhere, and they wanted to wipe out a race, and that was a Jewish race. But in here, it's like they want to wipe out Muslims, and it is being seen in Kashmir today. Our abrogation of Article 35A and 370 is an evidence. Then after this, illegal annexation of Kashmir and annexing it with India without any notice, just one very good morning, and they have just started doing it. and world is just looking after their economic endeavors. All they're looking at is that yes, India has more population. Yes, India has people who can be considered as, they have the buying power, so they have to have good relations with them because it's good for economy. Yes, it might be good for economy, but is it good for humanity? Are we looking at humanity after we look at our economic gains? So in today's world, we are propagating, or we are telling the world that okay, it's okay as long as you are killing Kashmiris, as long as you are killing minorities in India. Minorities in India, when I say minorities, is Muslims on the top, then Sikhs are being are facing the same. Forget about Sikhs, forget about Christians, forget about Muslims. What about Dalits? Dalits are written as Hindus in India, but still in 21st century, they are being considered as untouchables there. We are getting examples from India day after a day, and we are doing nothing about it. Girls are being raped, underage girls are being raped just because they are Dalits, just because they are Muslims, just because they are minorities. And if the culprits, they are Brahmins, nothing is being done against them. Same is the case with, if we take the previous examples, what happened in Samjhauta Express case. 4 people who were convicted by their own authorities, investigation authorities. Their federal investigation authorities conducted them investigations, and they booked 4 people for it. Why they were taken out? Because they had very good relations, or previously they were in touch with RSS. That's why they were members of RSS, and this was the sole reason that they were let free. Same was the case with Makkah Masjid bombing case in Hyderabad. Same was the case there. It was against Muslims, and it was conducted by the RSS members. So we need to understand, in today's India, it's RSS ruling, because BJP is an political offshoot of RSS, the same RSS that murdered Gandhi. I'm talking about Nathuram Godse was an RSS member. So now, if we come towards what is happening in Kashmir, well, Kashmir is the most militarized zone in the world right now. We need to understand very important thing. There are 3 corps which are active there, 14, 15, 16. And all of these corps, they have nearly 9 lakh active troops which are there. And for how many? 90 lakh of the Kashmiris. So if we take the average, for every 10 Kashmiri citizens, there is 1 soldier there carrying a gun, ready to butcher them. That's what it is happening in Kashmir right now. So world needs to understand this. World needs to understand this. And if we come towards our last bit, that is, how could it affect the regional and global peace? Well, don't you understand that the 2 very important countries which are involved right now are, both of the countries are having nukes? World should be wondering right now that they need to intervene. They need to come here for plebiscite in Kashmir. They need to resolve. They need to resolve Kashmir. The only reason is that if they don't do it, one very bad day, they would be listening this, that both of the countries, of course, they were in a conflict, and one side, which is being ruled by the radicals right now, that is India. India is being ruled by radicals. One bad day, they might do something In response, Pakistan would ensure that Pakistan responds as well in a defensive stance. Same happened last year. Did you not see that in February 2019, India went aggressive towards Pakistan? Because what India wants to do is, India wants to be hegemon towards its smaller neighbors. Why? Because it wants to create a regional hegemony. It wants to show to the world that if you want to talk to somebody in the region, in this region, then that must be India, because we are the hegemon of the region. And India conducts cross-border terrorism. We have proofs. Kulbhushan Yadav is a live proof. The only country which has been resisting this hegemony was Pakistan. They went towards Bangladesh, Bangladesh went quiet. They went towards Bhutan, it was quiet. They went towards Nepal, it was quiet, because it's entirely relying upon the Indians when it comes to economy. So every country, they went towards every country was quiet. But as soon as they came towards Pakistan with their ideas of surgical strike, which is being coined as a as a statement which can be considered as, if you conduct the surgical strike, it means that you have gained some kind of eternal power and you have the hegemony over the region. So they conducted it over Pakistan last year, and in response, Pakistan shot down 2 of their planes. And then obviously, when they were out of their brains and they didn't know what was happening within themselves, they shot down one of their Mi-17s as well. And then they came to know that our idea of pinning down the Pakistan was a very bad idea, and we shouldn't do it. And after that, I think Pakistan played very responsibly. With full responsibility, Pakistan handed over their pilot Abhinandan, and the job he was here for, he couldn't do it, so he's been handed over. And why? Because Pakistan wanted to de-escalate it. Pakistan did not go ahead with something because Pakistan knows Pakistan is a responsible country. Pakistan knows that both of the countries, they have nukes and it should de-escalate. So Pakistan is delaying and trying to de-escalate, but at the same time, the radical government of BJP in India is constantly bothering Pakistan. One more very important thing which world needs to look into is that when we talk about this particular region, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and China, and if we include the 2 countries in the middle of China and India, Bhutan and Nepal, if we take the population of these countries, it's half of the population of the world. So if there is something going on, and don't forget, the 3 of the countries are having nukes. So if something goes wrong with this part of the world, that means we are talking about something wrong with the half of the population of the world. So we need to understand these things. And I think it is the time that, world needs to play its role. And everyone knows we keep on repeating this, but the basic bone of contention between both of the countries is Kashmir. And it must be resolved if we really want to have a safer region as well as the safer world. And that could only be possible, that can be only be possible through having a dialogue with India and trying to tell them that the radical design they have in their country, it won't work for the world. And if countries like Turkey, if countries like Iran, if so many countries of the world can be sanctioned, why can't India be sanctioned? And I think world must need to look into it and do something about it. And the most powerful countries of the world they must come forward and do something about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Raja Faisal, for your valuable views on Indian hegemony, how peace global level. Now, I would like to invite our next speaker, who is Major retired from Army, Mr. Feminist in the nation, and he especially writes on radicalism and a prominent critique of the BJP's aggressive policies in the region. Mr. Adil Raja, over to you, sir.
Thank you so very much. I hope you can hear me all right. I suppose there was a problem of audio. Yeah, you can. That's good. Thank you so very much for having me here. I'll be very brief and I'll be very blunt at the same time. Please don't mind my manners. I am a soldier, and once a soldier speaks, so blunt things do come out. I would just like to talk from a realpolitik perspective, and at the same time, I would be straightforward. So the topic today here is Hindu radicalism and Indian hegemony, right? So we have to see, I'll just give you a bit of a perspective, historical background into this issue. This concept of Indian hegemony and this Hindu radicalism, it arises out of the political ideology of Hindutva. Now, Hindutva, mind you, is a political ideology. And if you ask, I wish there was somebody from India sitting here, some Sanghi maybe, I don't mind, but that person would have said that, listen, Hindutva as a theory is there to counter two-nation theory. That is, they blame the concept of Hindutva, which is a fascist concept, which is a fascist ideology, and which is the root cause of all evil in the most populous region of the world. That is this Hindutva fascism. So they would say that the Hindutva fascism, it came out of the two-nation theory of Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. Now, mind you, what they always fail to tell you is that the two-nation theory of presented by Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, which became the reason for partition of the subcontinent, that's India in 1947. I mean, we all know that the theory is that Muslims and Hindus, they are two separate nations, having separate cultures, having separate religion. So they're supposed to be separate, and that is why the partition took place. Now, they say that because of two-nation theory, we came up with Hindutva, the Hindus. That's wrong. You see, Sir Syed Khan came up with the two-nation theory because he, Urdu was the national language of India once it was under the colonial rule of the Brits. But once the Indians, they were giving the democratic powers, and they came into power as a result of the elections in 1934. They, even before that, they wanted to change Urdu. And because of their behavior, particular behavior towards Urdu as a national language, which is, a symbol of the culture of Muslims of India, they attacked it particularly. That's why Sir Syed Ahmad Khan came up with a two-nation theory. Now, initially it was just a theory. Nobody believed in it. Or if they believed in it, they believed it theoretically. They were not implementing it. They were not practicing it. So that is why Muslim League was on board with the All India National Congress at that time. And in 1934 elections, once this change once democracy was introduced in the colonial era, what the Muslim realized was, in the period of 4 years and 5 years which followed afterwards, they realized that because of the sheer numbers of the Hindus in India, they will always have the democratic majority in that country. And because of that democratic majority and because of the Hindutva mindset, they will always try to subjugate the Muslims, and they practically did it. They, at each and every occasion, they upheld the Hindu interest, they upheld the interest of this particular, okay, dominant majority, fine, but still, it was the Hindu majority. And the Hindutva leadership At that time, the Hindu leaders, they upheld the interest of Hindus. So in 1940, All India Muslim League in the leadership of Quaid-e-Azam came up with the Pakistan resolution, and within a short period of time in 1947, Pakistan was formed. But now we come to the second aspect of this entire problem of South Asia, of this Indian radicalization and this hegemonic design of India. The, the second problem, first was Hindutva, we've already discussed its origin. Now let's go over to the second problem, which is even the root cause of Hindutva itself. It is the Akhand Bharat. Akhand Bharat means United India theory. Now, as for the Indians, I wish somebody would have been here. They say that it's a prehistoric concept coming from the days of Chanakya. And he has given this theory of Akhand Bharat, United India. Akhand Bharat, mind you, is the root cause of all evils in South Asia. It gave birth to the concept of Hindutva. It gave birth to the concept of Indian hegemony. And it is the reason why in 1971, half of Pakistan was bifurcated and Bangladesh came into being, although we are happy today that Bangladesh is a Muslim country and it is fighting Hindutva fascism. But again, the problem of Indian hegemony is there because Bangladesh is covered from all three sides by India. And, you know, practically from the creation of Bangladesh up till now, they are still under the hegemony of India. I mean, they wanted to have their own independent foreign policy after they got separated from Pakistan and they became Bangladesh. But Indians, they implemented, they implemented their hegemony through Raw. There is a book by Zainul Abidin. I wish you guys read it. It's called Raw and Bangladesh. So it tells you in detail how from day one, as soon as the Pakistan army forces were pulled out, they surrendered and they were taken as prisoners of war. As soon as they were out from the scene, the loot and plunder of the Indian forces, they started off from there and then, and they were given a rude awakening, these guys. This writer, Zainul Abidin himself, you know, he was a so-called independence leader. He was a militant leader of Mujib Bahani. And he wrote this book and he said the day the Pakistan army went out, we knew we have been, you know, duped. And we've been duped into accepting the Indian hegemony. And till this date, that is what is going on in not only in Bangladesh, but all the countries of South Asia. You see, the same practice is going on because India, because of its sheer size, it borders all the countries of South Asia, whereas these countries in South Asia, they do not border each other. And because of this sheer geographical advantage, India is trying to spread its hegemony across. It is the geography of India which allows her to practice this hegemonic design. And now this concept of Akhand Bharat, I say that this devilish concept of Akhand Bharat. These policies which you've already discussed, this disinformation campaign is one thing. Then they are actively supporting, they're funding terrorism inside Pakistan, from Afghanistan, from Iran. Kulbhushan Jadhav, that is an example of that. We have recently presented a dossier to the United Nations about the Indian activities in their funding, terror financing, and funding of terrorists inside Pakistan. So we are presenting the proofs at the highest level, and all the in the background of all these activities, all these Indian hegemonic design is the concept of Akhand Bharat, mind you. Please note it down. And because of this Akhand Bharat concept, we are facing instability in the heaviest nuclear armed region of the world, and also with the biggest population. Half of the world is living here, and you've got three countries, as Raja Faisal rightly put across, that we are a nuclear armed countries. So nobody can assure, nobody can afford a nuclear war. That will be mutually assured destruction. Nobody wants that. Nobody wants mutually assured destruction. As a soldier, I know the cost of war. I don't want it. Even in India, they don't want it. Nobody wants it all over. So what's going to happen? But before I go and give you the solution, I won't take much of your time. I'm just going to tell you that before I go there and give you the solution, which in my mind, why the theory of Akhand Bharat is so important at this point in time. The reason is that the political parties in India which believe in the theory of Akhand Bharat, that is RSS and BJP, they openly propagate the theory of Akhand Bharat. They are in power. And not only they're in power for the second time, and their leader Narendra Modi and his government is the most popular government of India, mind you. It gives you an insight into the psyche of the people living in that country, the psyche of the Hindutva fascist mindset. Please try to understand. This is the psyche of the Hindutva fascist mindset, which believes in the theory of Akhand Bharat, and the parties they have voted into power is solely because of the reason that they are they are the backers of this theory. They want to make a Hindu Rashtra. What's a Hindu Rashtra? Again, it's Akhand Bharat. They want a united India, and for that, they are ready to employ any means whatsoever possible, as their political father Chanakya would say, that end justifies the mean. So we have to see that the countries that surround India, such as Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, Burma, they are nowhere at par with India because of their shared geography, as I've already discussed. So India is playing firstly that by creating a hegemony. For example, they don't want the Sri Lankans to buy the Pakistani fighter jets, and at the same time they don't want Bangladesh to do anything without asking them. There is a practical hegemony going on. I mean, Hindutva fascism is practically, it is engulfed entire country. But Nepal is landlocked, so they're all again dependent upon India. But in all this scenario, now coming over to the solution, one solution, and the logical solution is peace. Peace is the logical way forward. You guys are talking about it, and we back it. We are for it. We are all for it. But what is the other solution? Because you see, you have to be in a position of strength to dictate even a truce. You want Kashmir to be free, but you have to be in a position of strength to get the freedom of Kashmir. Nobody is going to give it to you in a plate. Please try to understand. Just read the history. That's what I was talking about. That I'll be talking about real politics. That's what I was saying. That I'll be talking bluntly, straightforward. Who is going to give you Kashmir? Are you guys fooling yourself? All right, fine. Please don't mind my words, as I've already said. I'm sorry, but you see, you are not going to get Kashmir just by asking for it. Your diplomatic missions are not going to get you Kashmir. So what's the solution? Now you see, there is a China-Pakistan alliance forming up. I would recommend my dear fellow esteemed guest sitting here, and whosoever is watching, to read my article in The Nation. It is about this alliance which is forming up between Pakistan and China. Of course, the military alliance is in the advanced stage right now. Now, as China, we know, was a sleeping giant. But because of the superpower rivalry between America and with India going into the American camp, Chinese are now much more active, aggressive, and they want to project themselves because they are being forced to. The most recent example is in Ladakh, where they have taken away their 39,000 square kilometer. That's not a small amount of land. 39,000 square kilometer. This figure has been accepted. Some people say, the independent media says that it's 90,000 square kilometer, but the Indians themselves in the parliament and Lok Sabha accepted that the Chinese had taken over 39,000 square kilometer of the territory which we claim. But at the same time, Indians are afraid to confront China because Chinese are way too ahead in military technology. And now with this alliance forming up between China and Pakistan, India is facing a singular front, mind you. Now, you want Kashmir, you have to be in a position of strength. And how to be in a position of strength? The only reason why India is practicing hegemony in the entire region is because of its sheer size. So you have to cut it down. How? There are 8 active insurgencies going on inside India. And there is a chicken net. Just open the map of the world and you will see map of India. You will see a chicken neck between Bangladesh and Nepal. And beyond that chicken neck is the head they call Assam. And there are 5 different independence movement, separatist movement going on there beyond the chicken neck. And all the leadership of these movements is right now sitting in China. What does that tell you? This is, I'm not claiming it, the Indian media claims it. Chinese are quiet about it, but the Indian media claims it. Now, these guys who are sitting in China, why do you think Chinese are hosting them? The active leadership which is fighting on ground is the lower tier leadership. And Indians themselves acknowledge that Chinese have not activated full-scale onslaught of this insurgency on India. But the way things are going, the way Indians are not willing to make peace with China and Pakistan to join the China-Pakistan economic corridor, they simply cannot because they are in the American board. And because of being in the American board, they have to confront China-Pakistan alliance. And at the same time, their political ideology, it does not allow them to move forward for a peace deal with Pakistan or China. So they are coming forward on a confrontation path with us. Now, in this confrontation path, there are 8 existing separatist movements, not only in the Northeast, in the Kashmir as well, and Khalistan movement, which was ruthlessly carved down through 1984 Sikh genocide. Now there's a farmers' protest going on over there, and they are telling the farmers that you are Khalistani terrorists. So you see there are fissures and fault lines within India, which needs to be exploited to bring India at the table for talks in which you'll ask for Kashmir. You have to be in a position of strength to get fair terms. India is not going to give you fair terms. There's no way in the world they're not going to give you a fair term, especially with BJP, RSS in power, who believes in Akhand Bharat at the cost of repetition, I'm telling you. And as per the surveys and as per the projections, even the next 2 governments are going to be this BJP government in India, because the people are brainwashed now. They are brainwashed zombies there. These Sanghis in India, we call them, Bhakts. They are brainwashed just like in the Hitler era. How could Hitler manage to create the Nazi race? How could Hitler manage to convince the entire German nation to go kill all the Jews in the world? And the dichotomy and the hypocrisy is that those Jews made Israel for their promised homeland, and that Israel is not supporting India in unleashing inhuman terror on Kashmiris. Just imagine that. But it's a game of national interest. We understand that. There are no friends and there are no foes, but there are national interests. They are permanent interest. Everything is not. So we understand that. And having said that, I would again come back and conclude that in order to get what you want, in order to stop the Indian hegemony in the region, nobody wants it, fine. And in order to get back Kashmir, you have to be in a position of strength, and the position of strength will come after the balkanization of India. Mind you, controversial statement, I know, but that's how it is. And it is very much a possibility under the present regime in India. The present regime is carrying out the kind of atrocities which nobody has seen. I mean, there are mob lynchings in India. Rapes are one thing. After every 21 minutes, there is a rape in India. That's part of the culture. In fact, the culture of South Asia is like that. And that's nothing to be proud of. Even in Pakistan, people have to pull up their socks, and they've come up with a new law now. And the Indians are making fun of us for making new laws to stop rape. Just imagine the psyche of these people. Now, these people are brainwashed, and they are brainwashed zombies. And just like in the Hitler era, Just like Goebbels has made that disinformation ministry, the Indians have been caught thanks to the modern technology, but EU disinformation lab. But the world now knows that India is spreading disinformation targeting Pakistan, but the Indians themselves, they don't believe it even now. Imagine. They have been brainwashed, and they are ready to believe anything which Narendra Modi says, irrespective of the fact that his performance is the worst in last 3 decades. Last 3 decades, I mean, the jobs in India have gone down. The economy of India has gone down. The national economy stats, they are there for everyone to see. I mean, everything is going downhill. Why the world still supports them? Because there is still a big market. So make it a short market then. Balkanization of India is going to make India a small market then. The influence India enjoys around the world is because of the sheer geography. So cut it down to size then. And we've got to do it. And you guys in India, you made us do it. You started it off in 1971. So do not expect us to now, take it sitting down quietly, because I mean, the only one hurdle in between Indians' hegemonic design is Pakistan, and it will stay like that. It will stay like it till the time Indian hegemonic designs, they don't end. And I've given you a solution how to end it. So I thank you very much. Sorry for taking too much of your time.
Mr. Adil Raja, I want to ask a question that how do you see the role of the community to stop the Indian hegemonic design in the region, or the Indian policies which are marginalizing the Indian minorities in India?
You see, as far as the information, you have to fight the disinformation with information. You're already doing that. There are organizations within India as well who are doing that. Okay. But you see, the thing is that, again, I would say at the cost of repetition, that if you want to get what you want, if you even want to get your rightful share, and even if you, I mean, getting Kashmir is the right of Kashmiris, isn't it? But then Pakistan has to be in a position of strength asking that. They have labeled your resistance to freedom fighters movement as terrorism. There is a dictionary which the Israelis use. The Indians have been using the same dictionary since 2009, and they have been able to label the freedom struggle of Kashmir, the armed resistance of Kashmir as terrorism, and they have been able to force Pakistan to take a U-turn in supporting it. Right now, whatsoever is going on over there is the indigenous freedom struggle. But you see, they are still no match to the world's heaviest deployment in any region. As Raja Faisal told you, there are 3 cores sitting there, heavy cores. In a small valley, there are 3 cores. And even then, they couldn't protect Ladakh. Even then, they couldn't protect their main supply route going to the subsector north and Siachen. The Chinese have cut it off. And then the world asked Pakistan, why are we supporting China? What, are you blind or something? Can't you see what the Indians are doing in this region? What kind of terror they're inflicting upon our people? And then you don't want us to fight them? We will fight. We will fight. Our Prime Minister said, La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. We'll fight. We'll fight till the end.
Thank you so much, sir, for your kind views and your detailed review on the Hindutva ideology and the practical solutions you have given to stop the Hindutva ideology, the Hindutva movement, which will impact on the region. Now I will move forward. Now I would like to invite Ms. Daniel Khan. She's a special assistant to Dean Elliot A. Cohen at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. She often appears on the international conferences about the rights of the Kashmiri people, which are in the of the Indian forces. Over to you, Ms. Daniel Khan.
Thank you so much, Zishan. Thank you, President Malik, and to COPAIR for having me today. And my sincere apologies for joining late. It's morning in the United States and my alarm did not go off, but I was determined to be on this important discussion and speak today. And as you mentioned, my background has been working on Kashmir. And so I'm really here today as a deeply concerned American citizen that has continually witnessed the ongoing human rights abuses in Kashmir and the rise of Hindu radicalism throughout the region since I first started visiting in 2016. And my remarks today are really geared toward those that may be listening that don't really understand what's going on. So really running through that and then giving some key examples while echoing what others have already shared. So around the world, and particularly in the West, the narrative is often shaped around Islamic radicalism. Rarely do you hear about right-wing extremism and its exploitation of Christianity or far-right movements in general. And along those same lines, we certainly hear very little, if at all, about Hindu radicalism in India. And the silence of the international community surrounding Hindu radicalism in India is highly problematic, and as the title of this webinar suggests, poses significant threats to regional and global peace. And as the world's largest so-called democracy, India continues to increase its discrimination and violence toward Muslims and minorities, like Raja had explained, Sikhs, Dalits at an alarming rate. In October 2019, 23 members of the European Parliament visited Indian-occupied Kashmir just 2 months after the Indian government removed Article 370, the region's special autonomous status. The trip sparked controversy when it was revealed that most of the MPs belonged to far-right political parties, including France's National Rally and Germany's Alternative for Deutschland. In an excerpt by Foreign Policy magazine, it wasn't just the affiliations of these visitors that drew attention. The MPs had been granted access to Kashmir even as foreign journalists and domestic politicians were barred access to the region. And the Indian-administered government had imposed an internet shutdown since August. This visit was a key example of the growing ties between the far-right Hindus in India and far-right in Europe, a connection that is rooted primarily in a shared hostility toward minorities and Muslims and couched in similar overarching nationalistic visions. Today, with the populist radical right ascendant in India and in several European democracies, the far-right agenda has been increasingly normalized and made a part of mainstream political discourse. And you may be wondering, why is this so concerning? How is this a threat to global peace, regional stability? Well, the link between far-right ideologies in these regions long predates the relatively recent rise of right-wing populist leaders. To see its growing normalization and expansion at this level should, in the contemporary world and within our political institutions, should be deeply concerning for us all. In the 1930s, Hindu nationalists collaborated with key figures in fascist Italy and Nazi Germany to help advance their extreme right-wing projects. One of the pioneers of Hindu nationalism, which I believe Raja mentioned, V.D. Savarkar, once wrote that India should model its approach to its Muslim problem on that used by the Nazis to deal with their Jewish problem. Hindu nationalists who follow RSS ideology, also popularly known as Hindutva, as others have said, have long sought to expand India's territorial reach into what was once British-controlled India, including not only Kashmir, but also Pakistan, Bangladesh, and other parts of South Asia. The Hindutva RSS regime seek to promote the ideals of upholding Indian culture and the values of a civil society while spreading the ideology of Hindutva to strengthen the Hindu community. As a result, acts of violence motivated by Hindutva and Hindu nationalists against Muslims, immigrants, and minorities have increased. Hindu radicalism is usually perpetrated by these members or alleged members of RSS and Abhinav Bharat. What we witness happen to the Jews during the Holocaust is playing out before our eyes to Muslims and minorities in India. And I don't understand how we as an international community can preach never again when it is happening again right before our eyes. The parallels of Hindu radicalism to the Nazi regime in Germany are not only deeply unsettling, but are incredibly dangerous. And those who attempt to speak out against Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his concerning RSS-backed politics, which are very sophisticated tactics, I might say, are silenced. For instance, Indian professor Anand Teltumde was arrested in 2019 after previously referring to PM Modi at a literary festival as a narcissist par excellence who could prove to be more dangerous than Hitler. he said Modi's politics rooted in Hindu nationalism amounted to fascism plus something. According to the New York Times, in the same speech, Mr. Teltumde stated Modi had enacted the carnage of Muslims in 2002, referring to the religious riots that killed more than 1,000 people in Gujarat when Modi was chief minister of that state. Modi has never been charged with a crime in connection with the violence, despite the mounting evidence. The silencing and lack of freedom of speech across India, as evidenced by the case of Mr. Teltumde, is a daily occurrence in Indian-occupied Kashmir and gravely impacts those who attempt to speak about the human rights atrocities. We know that with far-right movements, silencing is a key tactic used to hide and minimize the severity of the human rights abuses occurring on the ground. In the context of Kashmir, Kashmiris are afraid for their lives if they speak due to violent repercussions by the Indian Army, including arrest, torture, and therefore a false sense of democracy and a peaceful way of life is portrayed to the international community. It sadly reminds me of the Jews during the Holocaust, who were forced to show complicity in order to survive in concentration camps and ghettos. Just the other day, the Index on Censorship detailed the illegal detention of Kashmiri journalist Asif Sultan, who has been jailed for more than 800 days. Mr. Sultan was jailed for simply writing about the human rights abuses occurring in Kashmir and the death of freedom fighter Burhan Wani. Social media platforms aimed at speaking truth to power are often taken down after Hindutva social media armies report falsities about them and hurl violent abuses, death threats at activists. From a personal standpoint, I can't begin to tell you the threats that I have received, and I believe I saw even some foul language in this chat aimed at one of our speakers. Like the case of Gujarat, Modi has not been held accountable for the daily carnage he inflicts on Kashmiris, nor has he condemned Hindu radicalism and acts of violence against Kashmiris and other religious minorities across the country. Where was Modi when an 8-year-old Kashmiri girl, Asifa Bano, was brutally raped, tortured, and murdered by a gang of Hindu men in 2018? These men chose her specifically to send a message that they would terrorize her community of Muslim nomads in Rasana, a mostly Hindu village in Jammu and Kashmir. Only after mass protests erupted did Modi address the case. It is difficult to speak about, but the world needs to know what these men did to this child, solely to send their message that the Muslim nomads were not welcome. They kidnapped her from a meadow, stuffed drugs down her throat, and locked her up for 3 days in a temple where they beat, raped, and strangled her. What makes this case worse is that Hindu nationalists rally behind the perpetrators rather than condemn what they had done to this child. I'm sorry to get emotional. Her parents were forced to flee and bury her body. Her case is only one example of the many demonstrating the rise of Hindu extremism and violence against Muslims. There have been numerous lynchings and stabbings that are celebrated by the Hindutva. And these hate crimes have continued under Modi's watch. I actually just looked at CJ Werleman, who's a journalist. He has a database of the hate crimes. According to his data, 30% of the hate crimes increased from 2014 to 2017. And those numbers doubled when Modi was reelected in 2019. 50 Muslims were murdered in just the span between February 23rd to 29th of 2019. And I believe just the other day, another 28-year-old Muslim man was lynched and beaten to death by a Hindu mob in Bihar. We have seen the damage that can occur and rise in hate crimes through the example of the US, where I'm from, where the far-right movement has been emboldened by President Trump. Regionally in India, that is exactly what Modi is doing for his base, and it will only expand and worsen. There is a clear ethnic cleansing of Muslims and Kashmiris occurring, a sophisticated process carefully planned and executed by Modi's BJP government, which is backed by this fascist RSS regime. The unconstitutional removal of Article 370 has played a key part in this process, and is beyond unacceptable that the world just continues to sit idly by and watch it occur. As Indian novelist Arundhati Roy has said, the situation in India is approaching genocidal. The world continues to underestimate the potential threat to peace the Kashmir conflict and rise of Hindu radicalism holds not only for South Asia, but globally. As Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan stated at his speech at the United Nations in 2019, the Kashmir conflict has the potential to result in a devastating nuclear war between India and Pakistan. And I know my other panelists on here have mentioned that as well. And it is not just between India and Pakistan or even neighboring China. As Imran Khan rightfully stated, a nuclear war would have consequences far beyond the borders. We should already know this after the fallout following nuclear bombings in Japan's Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Despite these concerns, Modi continues to encourage Hindu radicalism and foster deeper rifts with Pakistan. He has even orchestrated fake surgical strikes across the line of control on Pakistan, claiming to have killed hundreds of Pakistanis to his thrilled Hindutva and Hindu nationalist followers. But these claims are inherently false, as there has been no evidence of such killings. As a result, this behavior by India has only escalated tensions between the two nations and further emboldened Hindu radicalisms, who celebrate and welcome the possibility of a full-blown war with Pakistan. Across India, anti-Muslim sentiments continue to rise through violent acts and discrimination. India has, by its declarations and actions, created conditions that pose an imminent threat to regional and international peace and security. It is only a matter of time before Modi's fanaticism results in grave repercussions. These potential repercussions must be taken seriously by the international community before it is too late. And we have seen what happens when the international community responds too late, as evidenced by the Holocaust, the 1994 Rwandan genocide, the 1995 Srebrenica genocide, and beyond. Repeatedly, it occurs, and we continue to learn nothing from the past. And there is mounting evidence that it is happening in Indian-occupied Kashmir and across India, and we must open our eyes. I know I have talked far too long, and I apologize for getting emotional, but I hope that my remarks today have demonstrated that the rise of Hindu radicalism can no longer be ignored, and that we must give a voice to the voiceless in Kashmir and across India who are suffering day in and day out. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Daniel Khan, for your valuable remarks, and we respect you for the people of Kashmir who are facing Indian atrocities for over 70 years. Now, I would like to invite Mr. Raja Faisal for a vote of thanks and concluding remarks and the way forward. Over to you.
Yeah, first of all, I would I would obviously like to highlight what Danielle Khan has just said. While she was talking, of course, all of us, we were emotional, and we were emotional for human cause, for humanity, and this is beautiful. Like, she is far away from here. She's obviously from America, and we have Claire. She's in Scotland, and they have joined us from far, and to talk about people of Kashmir. And this is so special, and the way she has highlighted the cases, and of course the rape cases which are being actively, the women and the girls, they are being persecuted at the hands of these powerful goons, I must say, these powerful goons who are ruling over India right now, and who are ruling over Indian streets right now. They are mobbing people, they are raping women, they are lynching people, and that is what is happening. And about way forward, of course, the only way forward is that the world powers, they need to sit together. They need to think about it positively, and they need to bring a solution on the table. Plebiscite, we always hear about. plebiscite, United Nations, they need to plebiscite in Kashmir. And it's not the time that we keep on, repeating things. It's time to do something about Kashmir. And, as they say, that every conflict ends with peace. Peace is the only end to every conflict. And we must need to work hard and work fast to bring that end sooner rather later. More the late we are, more the problem it would be for us. And right at the end, I must thank to everyone who joined us, especially Danielle, Claire. They joined us from America and Scotland, respectively. And we must thank our guests who joined us as an observer. Karen, she joined us as an observer. She's been observing us. And Adil Raja, Major Adil Raja, retired. He joined us and he gave a valued input today. As my president of COPER, she had to go to a meeting in Prime Minister's Secretariat, so she had to leave. But on her behalf, I must thank all of you, and I must thank Zishan as well, and the way they have conducted this webinar. And I'm so thankful to the whole staff that they have put an excellent effort to arrange it for us today. And I don't want to forget Fahad, because Fahad has been running around a lot while we were conducting it. So I actually sent him stars twice on our WhatsApp group, because I was telling him that it's an excellent work which you are doing, because if he wasn't there, I think it would have been very hard for us to have this excellent event we had today. Once again, I'm so thankful to all of you, and I must say Merry Christmas, because Christmas is approaching very soon. In advance, Merry Christmas from my side to whoever is celebrating. I mean, I personally celebrate it as well. Being a Muslim, it doesn't mean that I shouldn't be celebrating. I do celebrate, and I always do that. And all of you have a brilliant Christmas plus the New Year. And I hope the coming year we have a COVID-free year. We don't have COVID, because COVID is just taking the toll. And all we can do is pray about it. And everyone who's celebrating Christmas, please do pray during the Christmas event as well. Especially Claire, please. Because Claire, I really like your Christmas tree behind you. It's fantastic.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. My son put it up for me just to brighten the place up. It's great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We can see a tree behind Danielle as well, but it's not decorated.
Not this one. This is where I wish I was right now, on a mountain. So.
Oh, yeah. Thanks ever so much for joining us today. Inshallah, in the coming future, we would have you once more, and stay in touch with us. Thank you very much. And to the viewers as well, thanks for watching us. And if there is something you want us to improve in these webinars, please do come up with your suggestions as well. You can contact us on our pages, and you can contact us on YouTube as well, and on Twitter, on Facebook, wherever you would like. Please do contact us and give us suggestions so that we can improve ourselves more. Thank you very much, and bye from my side. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Raja. First, soon we will be. Hope to see you soon on our next webinar. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.